It is a massive binge of 90s nostalgia. But beyond the 90s nostalgia, there's an additional step, right? It's really understanding why did it work back then? Why was the 90s the way it was? And why will it not happen again? Why will it not be applicable now? So it's not just about reminiscing, it's not just about going down memory lane and reminiscing good memories, not just about that. It's about that and a deep dive into why was it like that? Why did it work and what made it so special? Hi everyone, this is Paul Loves Read, and as you know in this channel, it's all about spreading the love and joy for literature. And we hope our little channel helps you find the right book for you. Today I'm going to share with you this really fun book to all the 90s babies, 80s babies out there. You will enjoy this. The book is aptly called The 90s by Chuck Klosterman. Fairly new, published in 2022. So it's very nostalgic book. What is this book? It's a nonfiction book. It's basically, it's a nostalgic book because it talks about the 90s, what made the 90s unique from the decades before and after it. I was looking for an easy read at the time, a nonfiction easy read at the time, and the 90s pop culture in the 90s era where I grew up in as a kid or slash teenager, whatever, is one of the best years of my life. And I am in that age group of having and I'm happy about this, I'm in that small section of age group wherein we got to enjoy the time before the internet and also after the internet. So that is a unique period of time. Internet was first. When was the first internet, Han? Early 90s, right? That's why I feel like the 90s is unique in that sense, and I feel like the kids who grew up in this decade has that shared experience that only that decade can give. So when I saw this book, I got really curious. And I thought, hey, let's go down memory lane and let's see. It's a lot to unpack, but again, it's all about the 90s. It highlights what made the 90s unique and fun and really quite singular, right? Each decade, and the author says this, each decade would have its own kind of definition or what makes it that decade, right? The 60s, the 70s, the 80s. The 90s has it too. So he talks about that. And then one of the most interesting things that he said in the book is about the advent of communication in media during the 90s, wherein media is so readily available. Great TV shows have sprung up, and it's passed on and it became the popular culture at the time. But at the same time, it is so hard to replicate. It is so hard because there wasn't, the technology back then is not enough to kind of give us, for example, large storage for large data. We don't have that back then. So in the 90s, you have the literal tape, VHS, and so on, and that's the only way you could watch a TV show, for example. So I'm saying this because it's one of the most interesting and one of the most defining moment of the 90s, that explosion of movies and different types of media, right? TV shows, and he highlighted Seinfeld, Friends, yung mga sikat na 90s show, which essentially defined a generation. And I have to say though, this is an exclusively American point of view, by the way. This is talking about the 90s in America. But again, I can relate to it because it's not so far off what I grew up in, because, we have a Western-esque culture here. So I know of these things. I know Seinfeld. I know Friends. We grew up with Friends and so on and so forth. Apart from that, apart from TV shows, it is also the glory times of MTV, right? So this is the time where, oh my gosh, we follow MTV religiously. Every Sunday, we want to find out what is the top 10 music and so on, and what made that era, what made MTV a hit show, and how did it affect culture. Of course, speaking of MTV, he talked about fashion and music. What type of music did we love back then? And this is the era of great alternative bands, right? Like grunge bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Smashing Pumpkins, and all of them. It's like that's that decade. And why did it work back then? And why was the style the way it was? And what does it say about the 90s generation? And so on and so forth. It is a massive binge of 90s nostalgia. But beyond the 90s nostalgia, there's an additional step, right? It's really understanding why did it work back then? Why was the 90s the way it was? And why will it not happen again? Why will it not be applicable now? So it's not just about reminiscing. It's not just about going down memory lane and reminiscing good memories. Not just about that. It's about that and a deep dive into why was it like that? Why did it work and what made it so special? If you're a kid who grew up in the 90s and you're in for, a light, yun na nga, like a fun look back, I think you will enjoy this. Aside from it's a fun read and aside from just going down memory lane, right? I think there's value in having to step back, and there's value in looking at our decade from a outsider perspective, right? Because it's gone, it's done. And why do you feel like understanding why do you feel that 90s was a great decade for you or not? Depends. And that stepping away from it, like looking at it from a third party outsider perspective, that gives you another layer of understanding and perspective also on what that decade was all about and how that decade impacts now. Actually, you know what? Those who would enjoy this are, of course, the ones who lived through it, right? Like you and I. We would enjoy this because we lived through it. But for those who are of other generations, you may generational gap, whatever, this is a good, fun, informational book, I feel like, for the younger generation. And they would understand what the 90s is all about. And they will see the big difference. Because, somebody being born, na namulat ka na ng may internet, right? You grew up with a completely different sense, or not different, a completely new sense of normal. Meaning to say, you grew up knowing that internet is a must, you have a smartphone, Wi-Fi is this, is ganyan, ganyan, ganyan. You cannot imagine a life before that. If you're curious about that, then this, I think, is a good primer to it. And another unique thing about the 90s decade is that it is so removed and far away from our current decade, but at the same time, it was just last decade. It wasn't that far off. But in terms of culture and feeling and way of life, it's almost alien. Parang layo niya na, 'di ba? The 90s culture and life, way of life might be closer to the 80s way of life than it is now. But at the same time, 90s and the 2000s is just one after the other. So to me, that's just, 'di ba? That's amazing. It's not too far off. So, yeah, from that angle, you could look at it from that angle. Almost like a history lesson of sorts, but in a fun, very fun read. Very fun read. Yeah. In conclusion, it's a fun read. I would recommend it for my friends in my own age range. But yeah, if you're looking for a fun, easy nonfiction read about just the previous decade, just a sneak peek into what it was like and understanding how technology was so different back then and how technology really changed the culture and changed the way we live when we entered the 2000s. I think this is a good insightful book for that. So there you have it. Thank you.